Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Thursday, May the 12th, 2022. Let's begin by talking about Russia and the Ukraine. And one of America's most foremost and revered religious leaders has stepped in to give a bull, one might call it. And this is from Chris Manahan at Information Liberation. Nancy Pelosi said, when you're thinking about what 40 billion in Ukraine is about, just think about when I was hungry, you fed me from the Gospel of Matthew. Yes, speaking on the House floor, she said, quote, the brutality of Putin is not just what he's doing in Ukraine, but the impact that it's having on food for the world. So when you're home thinking what all this is about, just think about when I was hungry, you fed me in the Gospel of Matthew. Her comments came as part of a speech largely centered on what the massive amount of financial aid would do for the Ukrainians amid food shortages in the country that is America. Due to the war with Russia, despite shortages being felt by Americans here at home, some critics slammed Pelosi's reference to the gospel by asking if she would apply that to other policy points, and others joked that defense contractors were the ones truly gaining from the aid bill. Yes, when I was hungry, you fed me javelins, stingers, and suicide drones. When I sought out peace, you paid me $53 billion in bribes to keep the war going and send my countrymen into a meat grinder. There's a piece at Zero Hedge by Portfolio Armor called A Victory Day in Moscow. On Monday, Russia celebrated Victory Day, commemorating the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. Western observers watched President Putin's traditional speech with interest for clues about what might happen next in the war in Ukraine. And David Pinson tweeted, this conciliatory gesture to Americans was a pleasant surprise, especially in light of last week's leaks about U.S. intelligence being used to kill Russian generals and sink their Black Sea flagship. What Putin said was, we know that American veterans who wanted to come to the parade in Moscow were effectively banned from doing so, but I want them to know we are proud of your exploits, your contribution to the common victory. We honor all the soldiers of the Allied armies, Americans, British, French, participants in the resistance, brave soldiers and partisans of China, all who defeated Nazism and militarism. Broadly speaking, there were two popular theories about what Putin would say in this speech. One, he'd have a mission accomplished moment, like that of President George W. Bush on the aircraft carrier in 2003. Two, Putin would announce an escalation in Ukraine, including possibly a formal declaration of war or a mass mobilization in Russia to continue the war. In the end, neither of those things happened. The subtext of the speech seemed to be that Putin thinks Russia is winning in Ukraine, and he's not in a particular hurry to wrap up the war. There's some evidence he might be right. Let's review. As I wrote last month, the West may have underestimated the size and strength of the Russian economy in launching its economic war against it. Atoms versus bits, basic materials versus finance and services. Now, The Economist notes that Russia's economy is back on its feet. Russia appears to be keeping up with payments of its foreign currency bonds. The real economy is surprisingly resilient too. Oh, yes, the real economy. That's a curious admission from The Economist, isn't it? Isn't The Economist in favor of the total financialization of the economy, where there's just computer bits flying back and forth? We don't need to make anything anymore. Making things is for losers. And digging up resources from the ground, very, very bad, since carbon, of course, is man's eternal enemy. Dave Pinson comments, one indicator of resiliency is the performance of the ruble since the invasion started. It's now up about 18% in dollar terms since February the 24th. After initially raising its key rate to 20% to support the ruble, Russia's central bank has since lowered its rate twice, first to 17% and now to 14%, still high, but seemingly appropriate given Russia's inflation rate of 16.7%. Having its key rate in the ballpark of its inflation rate is something the United States once did as well. There is an actual war in Ukraine and an information war about what's happening there. So it can be hard to sort through propaganda from both sides to see what's actually happening. One thing to keep an eye out is for the military equivalent of a statement against interest. When Russia said its Black Sea flagship, the Moskva, sunk, that was one such statement against interest. It does them no benefit to acknowledge a defeat like that, so we can assume it's likely true. Similarly, if a Western analyst says Ukraine may not be doing well militarily, we can assume that analyst is on the level as well, since the West is backing Ukraine in this war. With that in mind, consider the comments by Colonel Marcus Reisner of the Austrian Military Academy. Quote, Ukraine's situation is much worse than is believed in the West. The bitter truth is Putin can win the war, unquote. This from Arnaud Bertrand. He notably says that a not inconsiderable part of the weapons delivered to Ukraine are either captured or destroyed by the Russians, and that the amount of weapons delivered within a week only last a single day on the battlefield before they're used up or captured by Russia. Bertrand links to a German article quoting Reisner, but you can read an English translation of it here. Colonel Reisner also posts weekly briefs on the war on YouTube. They're in German too, but by clicking on settings, you can turn on English subtitles. In last week's video, he analogized the situation in the Donbass region of Ukraine to World War I trench warfare. The Russians are up against fortifications and trench systems that the Ukrainians have established over a period of years, so their progress has been very slow. But Russia has an advantage in artillery and air power over Ukraine. Big Serge had tweeted, so to recap, the Russian army deploys artillery with 3 times the density of an equivalent American formation, and their weapons have a range advantage. It's all about firepower. Russia isn't fighting the American army, and God willing, they never will. However, American doctrine is a starting point for Western militaries, and Ukraine is operating at a similarly huge artillery disadvantage, but without the air superiority that America can count on. Portfolio armor comments. That advantage may be lessened by the enormous amount of Western and in particular American aid being sent to Ukraine, but there are 2 points to bear in mind regarding that. The first is Colonel Reisner's comment about the amount of Western equipment that gets destroyed or captured by the Russians. So much has gotten captured that Russia has printed Russian instructions for some weapon systems like anti-tank rockets for its troops. The second is some of what's going on with these Western aid deliveries is the equivalent of cleaning out the garbage. Consider that the U.S. is giving Ukraine 200 M113 armored personnel carriers. These are aluminum alloy hulled Vietnam-era vehicles that offer protection against rifle rounds and little else. The U.S. military announced plans several years ago to replace its M113s with armored multi-purpose vehicle manufactured by BAE Systems. A cynic might wonder if dumping M113s off on Ukraine is a way of expediting that purchase order. Let's wrap this up by turning our focus to something actionable, what we can do with our own investments in light of the war and other gloomy news. In an article last week, I showed one approach. Let's say you have $50,000 to invest now, but you don't want to risk losing more than 20% in a worst-case scenario. On Monday, our system might have presented this portfolio to you, which is essentially a hedged bet on natural gas and corn getting more expensive and European and emerging market stocks getting cheaper over the next 6 months. And over at moonofalabama.org, after a lot of talk about defeating Russia in the Ukraine and an alleged lack of Russian fighting abilities, Congress passed another $40 billion fund for weapons and economic support. That brings the total to some $53 billion. Most of the money will go to the U.S. weapons industry, the CIA, and to various Ukrainian oligarchs. Hardly anything will be received by those in need. With that packet now passed, reality is allowed to sneak into U.S. media reporting on the issue. Not one, but 2 reports in the New York Times suddenly lament about the huge area of land the Russian troops have taken in East Ukraine. One How much of Ukraine does Russia hold? And two, Ukraine war's geographic reality. Russia has seized much of the east. From the latter. Nonetheless, the Donbass seizure, combined with the Russian invasion's early success in seizing parts of southern Ukraine adjoining the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia illegally annexed in 2014, gives the Kremlin enormous leverage in any future negotiation to halt the conflict. And the Russians enjoy the added advantage of naval dominance in the Black Sea, the only maritime route for Ukrainian trade, which they have paralyzed with an embargo that could eventually starve Ukraine economically and is already contributing to a global grain shortage. Moon of Alabama comments, I've often pointed out that the Ukraine front line will have a large number of casualties from Russian artillery strikes. It is even worse than I had thought. At the main hospital in Kramatorsk, a city in Donetsk, ambulances stream in day and night carrying soldiers wounded at the front who describe being pinned down by near constant shelling. About 80% of the patients are wounded by explosives such as mines and artillery shells, said Captain Eduard Antonovsky, the deputy commander of the medical unit at the hospital. Because of this, he said, very few patients have serious injuries. Either you're far enough from an explosion to survive or you aren't, he said. We either get moderate injuries or deaths. Additional to those more realistic reports, the New York Times allowed one of its authors to write an opinion piece against the widening of the war. America and its allies want to bleed Russia. They really shouldn't. At first, the Western support for Ukraine was mainly designed to defend against the invasion. It is now set on a far grander ambition to weaken Russia itself. Presented as a common sense response to Russian aggression, the shift, in fact, amounts to a significant escalation. By expanding support to Ukraine across the board and shelving any diplomatic effort to stop the fighting, the United States and its allies have greatly increased the danger of an even larger conflict. They are taking a risk far out of step with any realistic strategic gain. When I was in the Ukraine during the first weeks of the war, according to the New York Times writers, even staunch Ukrainian nationalists expressed views far more pragmatic than those that are routine in America now. Talk of neutral status for Ukraine and internationally monitored plebiscites in Donetsk and Luhansk have been jettisoned in favor of bombast and grandstanding. What's more, the invasion has led directly to greater military spending in second and third tier European powers. The number of NATO troops in Eastern Europe has grown tenfold, and a Nordic expansion of the organization is likely. A general rearmament of Europe is taking place, driven not by desire for autonomy from American power, but in service to it. For the United States, this should be success enough. It is unclear what more there is to gain by weakening Russia beyond fantasies of regime change. And the editorialist concludes, diplomatic efforts ought to be the centerpiece of a new Ukraine strategy. Instead, the war's boundaries are being expanded and the war itself recast as a struggle between democracy and autocracy, in which the Donbass is the frontier of freedom. This is not just declamatory extravagance. It is reckless. The risks hardly need to be stated, unquote. Indeed, the current U.S. strategy will end in a catastrophe for Ukraine because it is based on false narratives. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis has consistently provided a more realist view of the military situation in Ukraine. His latest piece fits that record. Russia's progress in Donbass means Ukraine likely won't win the war. Over the past few days, a flurry of senior leaders in both Ukraine and Washington have issued defiant claims of not merely resisting Russian aggression, but pushing towards outright victory. While such aspirations are entirely understandable, it is unwise to set policy seeking a preferred outcome if there does not exist a rational path by which Ukraine could accomplish that objective. At present, most indicators, fundamentals of war, and current battlefield trend lines support the prospect of a Ukrainian defeat. By continuing to seek a military victory in Ukraine, Ukraine's troops will continue fighting. No negotiated settlement will be realistically sought, and most likely Russian troops continue making progress. As a result, more Ukrainian civilians and troops will continue to be killed and wounded, more cities destroyed, and the economic and food crises for both Ukraine and the world will worsen. The most likely outcome will not change a negotiated settlement, not a Ukrainian military victory, but the cost to Kiev will be much, much worse. Another former military man who has a realist view of the war is Colonel Douglas Macgregor, retired. During the first Gulf War, he led a unit in the Battle of 73 Easting. Oh, and now we're really through the looking glass here. The threat of Polish involvement in Ukraine, which I suggested a few weeks ago. I remember years ago, I was friends with a Polish professor at the University of BC and his wife, who worked in the library. And I remember her once telling me that Kiev, it was, is, and always shall be a Polish city. There's still a fair amount of irredentism in Poland, considering the historic territories which were, well, stolen by the communists, and Poland was moved to the west. Well, 47% of the Poland in 1939 was stolen by the communists. So let's talk about that. This is a piece in the American Conservative by the aforementioned Douglas McGregor. In economics, wrote John Kenneth Galbraith, the majority is always wrong. Galbraith might have added that in military affairs, there's a mountain of historical evidence to suggest that American generals and military analysts are always wrong, too. When the Spanish Civil War ended in March 1939, after 3 years of brutal fighting that saw Soviet, German, and Italian equipment, advisors, and troops in heavy combat, senior military leaders in London, Paris, and Washington found surprisingly little evidence to suggest a profound change in warfare. In fact, a U.S. Army officer who later became a major general witnessed the fighting and suggested in Spain the theories proclaimed for the devastating power of panzer divisions and other massed armored formations used independently or apparently refuted by actual events, unquote. 5 months later, events in Poland would repudiate these words, but at the time, his views were widely shared in the West. The war against Russia in Ukraine is different from the Spanish Civil War. It's a proxy war designed to employ the full range of American allied capabilities against Russia in Ukraine. If Americans are beginning to wonder whether Washington's enormous investment in Ukrainian assistance has colored the opinions of U.S. analysts and their evaluation of events in Ukraine, their suspicions are justified. And then he talks about the aid. But perhaps most important, in Ukraine, U.S. advisors provide intelligence and targeting guidance, along with the rapid resupply of critical warfighting equipment. As the fighting raged in Ukraine, as if on cue, retired U.S. Army generals appeared on television to herald an imminent Ukrainian victory based on the country's allegedly spectacular battlefield successes and Russia's extraordinary incompetence. Russian forces, they argued, were doomed to defeat by serious tactical errors, logistical shortfalls, and weak execution. In retrospect, some of these comments involved mirror imaging, but much of the criticism almost certainly reflected the sunk costs of U.S. investment in Ukrainian military capability. It did not take long for American analysts to insist that the Russian military leadership had made the unpardonable mistake of not front-loading the Russian offensive in Ukraine with strikes from precision-guided missiles, Desert Storm style. American military pundits and their British colleagues were also quick to pass judgment on the failure of Russian ground forces to race west along 2 or 3 major axes. If Ukrainian forces could inflict enough human and equipment losses on Russian forces, the narrative went, Moscow would abandon its objectives and withdraw its forces. Of course, expecting the Russians to suspend operations on such spurious grounds makes about as much sense as expecting Washington to sue for peace after Pearl Harbor. The retired generals paid little attention to the operational situation. Contrary to the picture painted by Western analysts, Russian ground forces pressed forward, moving methodically along a 300-mile front to identify and selectively attack Ukrainian forces. Few analysts in the West knew or cared that Russian commanders were instructed to avoid collateral damage to the civilian population and infrastructure. Initially, concerns about collateral damage clearly constrained the Russian army's action, but in time, Russian operations encircled key urban areas in eastern Ukraine where Ukrainian forces sought to establish defensive strongholds stocked with ammunition, food, and water. Russian operational intent changed, focusing on systematically reducing the encircled Ukrainian forces and not on capturing metropolitan areas. Now, Poland. Confronted with the unambiguous failure of U.S. assistance and the influx of new weapons to rescue Ukrainian forces from certain destruction, the Biden administration is desperate to reverse the situation and save face. Poland seems to offer a way out. Most important, a Polish president, Andrzej Duda, and Ukrainian president, Vladimir Zelensky, have both expressed a desire to erase the borders between Poland and Ukraine. Unconfirmed reports from Warsaw indicate that after Washington rejected the proposals for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, along with the transfer of Polish MiG-29 aircrafts to Ukrainian pilots, the Polish General Staff was quietly instructed to formulate plans for intervention in the Ukrainian conflict by seizing the western part of Ukraine. Naturally, military action of this scale would require Kiev's support, but given Washington's de facto control of the Zelensky government, approval for Polish military intervention should not be a problem. Presumably, the Biden administration may hope that a collision involving Russians and Poles in any form, including air and missile strikes against Polish forces on the Ukrainian side of the border, would potentially call for the NATO Council to meet and address Article 5 of the NATO Treaty. Whether a Polish military intervention into Ukraine justifies the commitment of NATO members to war with Russia is unclear. Action still would be left up to the judgment of each NATO state. And Colonel McGregor concludes, about the most that any analyst can say with confidence at this point is that Polish military intervention would confront NATO members with the specter of war with Russia, the very development most NATO members oppose. Setting aside whether Polish ground forces are ready to execute the mission in the face of Russian opposition, Polish action would satisfy the neocons in Washington, D.C. Poland may well be the key to widening NATO's war with Russia in Eastern Europe. Why? Because the Polish catalyst for conflict with Russia presents the American people with a war that Americans do not want but cannot easily stop. Such a war with Russia would be a war that began without an objective appraisal of American vital interest, the distribution of power inside the international system, or the existence of any concrete threats to U.S. national security. I mentioned this before, I'm going to repeat it again, that what is happening on the ground in Ukraine? Are we getting any information on that? Well, the media doesn't seem to be particularly interested because we all know how it's going to turn out. Stunning victory for sexy superstar Vladimir Zelensky. And the Russians are orcs. They're subhuman. This is, we've been hearing a lot about this. The Russians are subhuman. Major Tom Nichols devoted a tweet storm. 1,200 years of Russian history. It's just horrible, 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 horrible. And the Russians are Untermenschen. And of course, this is near genocidal talk. But the neocons, remember, are a death cult. This is again from Chris Menahan at Information Liberation. Now that Ukraine has secured a whopping $53 billion in military economic aid from the U.S. in just 3 months, the Zelensky regime is moving to plunge Europe into chaos in the name of fighting the Ruskies. From Voice of America News, Ukraine cuts off Russian natural gas pipeline supplying Europe. Yeah, okay. Cutting off the nose to spite their face. Europe is already seeing record inflation and energy prices are through the roof, thanks largely to U.S. and EU-led sanctions targeting Russia. Cutting off their pipelines is only going to push prices higher. Brent crude surged 5.5% to $108.09 a barrel after the news was released Wednesday. Draining America's strategic oil reserves can only do so much. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Dan, Div of the Dome, and Run 7 on the dot. Yes, I tried to start the show exactly at 7 p.m. Eastern. Hello to Denny McDougall. Respectable commenting name, Brian Frakes. Hello, just killed 43 plus minutes on yet another U.S. TV show produced in B.C. Hello to Dan Ellison, John S. David the Gnome says, LOL, Pelosi is going to split hell wide open. Pelosi open for you two in Kyiv, says Chogokin 666. Hello. I've heard stories of AK rounds penetrating M113, says Brian Frakes. No sleep till Breezewood, Pennsylvania, says the price of corn is up. The selfish meme says I planted corn this year, so I should be set this fall. Joken666 calls the M113 the rolling hot box. And who else do we have here? I don't like stuffed burgers. Leave my disc of cow alone. No surprises. Stuffed burgers? Stuffed with what? I've never come across this. Hello to Gamian. Zelensky, the high-heeled hero, says Dan. Oh, we have a lyric quotation from The Fix from Don Willis. Standerfall, state your case tonight. Do you remember when the left was anti-war? Do you remember that? I do. I suppose I'm an old man. This is from Glenn Greenwald and his Twitter feed. The U.S. anti-war left is dead. The Squad's $40 billion war vote just killed it. For years, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Squad postured as standard left-wing anti-war and anti-imperialism activists. They railed against massive U.S. expenditures to Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and the CIA. Now they just voted for one of the largest war packages ever. And in AOC's own words, she had slammed Congress for senselessly boosting the defense budget every year. During AOC's 2018 primary, she was unknown. Ryan Grimm suggested I did and became an enthusiast. I interviewed her. She vowed to vote no on Pelosi, railed against identity politics, said establishment, GOP, and Dems were the enemy, denounced war budgets. Where is this, AOC? Meanwhile, what can one even say about this Ilhan Omar statement from March the 8th, barely 2 months ago? She says flooding Ukraine with massive amounts of U.S. money and weapons would be likely disastrous, unpredictable, and likely disastrous. Even more pathetic is the behavior of the Bernie AOC left. They don't want it on their permanent record in the guidance counselor's office that they supported Biden's escalation in the Ukraine. But they're also not allowed to criticize the Squad who just voted for it. What to do? Facing this dilemma, the Bernie AOC left opted for silence, abstained from what is by far the largest and most dangerous U.S. war involvement in decades, a complete abdication. So far, the only U.S. left war opposition comes from Chomsky YouTube interviews and a few dissident voices. Meanwhile, the only anti-war and anti-imperialism message in the U.S. comes from a dozen right-wing House members and a few Fox hosts. That's it. The U.S. left is internationally is loudly opposed, but the mainstream U.S. left are cowardly to supportive. Even the New York Times, even the war-supporting New York Times, is aghast that so few people have the courage even to question or scrutinize these gigantic expenditures and weaponry Biden is sending to Ukraine via Raytheon CIA. The Squad is united with Marco Rubio and Liz Cheney, fully on board. The most amazing part of it all, Greenwald writes, is that not one Squad member who just hopped on the board with neocons and the pro-war wing of both parties bothered to explain their vote. Some haven't mentioned the Ukraine in months, but they know their followers don't care. Two of the smartest young leftists on YouTube, long supporters of the Squad, confront the reality of who they are and what they just did with this vote to send $40 billion more to Raytheon and CIA for Ukraine. For smart/honest leftism, watch Vanguard Pod. Dan Crenshaw, he is gung-ho. I mean, just gung-ho. He served in war and he lost an eye thereby. And he seems to, he's the new John McCain. There isn't a war anywhere in the world, a potential war anywhere in the world that America could get involved with where he is not cheering on gung-ho. This is from Rob Crilly at the Daily Mail. Republican lawmakers Marjorie Taylor Greene and Dan Crenshaw traded blows on Twitter as they renewed their bitter feud, this time over a $40 billion Ukrainian aid bill. Crenshaw has clashed repeatedly with right-wing firebrand Green over her bombastic approach to politics. And on Wednesday, he suggested her opposition to the humanitarian military assistance bill was part of an effort to woo the Russian establishment and its state-controlled media. Still going after that slot on Russia Today, huh? He said as they traded barbs on the wisdom of backing the Ukraine. Sick burn, Dan. And it was a reminder of the way the pair clashed last year when Green said the former Navy SEAL was firing blanks after he complained about the grifters and performance artists in their party. Yeah. Crenshaw was heavily ratioed on Twitter by someone who at the time had something like 300 followers. He made a comment about Crenshaw never meeting a war that he didn't approve of and just brutally treated. From antiwar.com, Finland announces plan to join NATO. UK and Sweden say relations with Putin can never be normalized. Never. Never, huh? Wow. Relations with Germany and Japan were normalized after 1945. And it really didn't take all that long. Ukraine accused of deadly cross-border attack in Russia. Leader of Ukraine's Kherson to ask Putin to join Russia. Ukraine shuts pipeline. Yes, we know that already. Senator Tuberville, U.S. risks war with Russia by poking the bear. Poll, more Americans are okay with Ukraine losing to Russia. And I see that the Russians with Attitude podcast, or its Twitter feed, is amazingly still up on Twitter, although it's very annoying going to any Twitter feed which attempts to bring us actual news where they say, yes, this is too horrifying for you to see. You're going to have to change your Twitter bio to include your age. And what do we have here? Sometimes I wish I could just block whole countries on Twitter so I wouldn't have to read their tweets. The list of countries I'm thinking about doesn't include Ukraine or the US for what it's worth. It's not a crime if it's done to orcs. Also, all the orcs in Crimea are actually Ukrainian patriots. Also, it didn't happen. Also, it happened. They deserved it. Also, they did it to themselves, would be the average answer to this question. And the question is, isn't this a war crime, withholding water? Yukis can do anything. Yeah, they can. They're supermen, apparently. Despite the fact that their army at the beginning of this conflict was 3 times the size of Russia's, they haven't really fared very well. Of course, the question is how many of these members of the Ukrainian army really want to fight against Russia over the Donbass. Apparently, young Ukrainians in Warsaw are wreaking havoc and killing Poles. Any truth to this? And there's a video. Warsaw at night. This is from at Maps Ukraine. After, what happened in 1939 to 1945, the Poles, well, let's say, have good reason to be suspicious of or to simply dislike the Ukrainians. This is from Hemday. Drunken Ukrainian brawlers in Warsaw begin to molest the girl. A Polish guy stood up for her. A fight ensued. Not only fists were used, but also stabbing and cutting. Ukrainian drunkards beat the guy and inflicted many stab wounds on him, because of which he died. Yeah, good luck this showing up in the regime media. Because we know that the Ukrainians are saintly people, and all that stuff you may have heard about the Azov Brigade. For instance, like Canada training it. Oh yeah, they're just kind of funny about decorations. Totenkopf, swastikas, that sort of thing. It's not really significant. Next, they're going to, I suspect, claim that it's ironic somehow. Yeah, and again, age-restricted adult content. Yeah, like I've never seen a destroyed tank before or destroyed building before. Let's go to Pedro Gonzalez. Give me a sec here. And here we go. McConnell is an America last traitor. You aren't going to fix this country with Republicans like him because his job is to manage our decline. Arta Moini tweeted, Bravo, Rand Paul, U.S. military aid exacerbates and prolongs global conflicts rather than ending them while enriching war machine rentiers and establishment courtiers. It is a tax on the U.S. economy and the American people with zero benefit to them. And yes, I'm reminded that Van Cliburn, the Texas pianist, was allowed to go to the Soviet Union in the early 60s, where he won the Tchaikovsky competition, which was a big sensation. Glenn Gould, the Canadian pianist, toured the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. But now apparently we're facing a threat which is greater than that, which is obviously completely absurd. But I don't know. What is it? Is it mass formation psychosis? Is it a collapse in general intelligence? Universal mental retardation? Is it simply an unwillingness to become engaged in this sort of thing? Yeah, what are you going to do? Right? Let's talk about the latest round of The Bachelor or The Bachelorette instead. Perhaps people don't believe that there's anything that they can do about it. It's a piece by Matthew Thomas at unheard.com. His Substack is called Vulgar Marxism. Ever since Joe Biden's election, the media has displayed an almost obsessive interest in the Democratic Party's dwindling popularity among the working class and its booming support among affluent professionals. The trend has been so dramatic that some Republicans have sought to rebrand the GOP as the party of the multiracial working class. But will this strategy work? To truly understand the gentrification of the Democratic Party, we need only observe how the class composition of the Democratic presidential primary electorate shifted between 2008 and 2020. Looking at the 16 states that voted in both 2008 and 2020 before the winner was all but decided, the trend is the same. Poor and working class voters are shrinking as a share of the Democratic electorate, while middle class and affluent voters are growing. In these 16 states, counties where the median household income is under $60,000 a year went from contributing 35.3% of the presidential primary vote in 2008 to just 28.6% in 2020. By contrast, counties where the median household income is over $80,000 a year rose from 24.5% to 30.7%, with almost half of that growth in counties where the median household income is over $100,000 a year. In some states, this transformation was particularly astonishing. In Virginia, for instance, counties where the MHI is under $60,000 a year accounted for 32% of the vote in 2010, while counties where the MHI is over $100,000 accounted for 34.4%. 10 years later, the state's poorest counties contributed just 25.3% of the presidential primary vote, while the richest counties contributed 41.4%. During the same period in South Carolina, the electorate shifted away from poor and working class counties and toward middle class counties by 20%. In North Carolina, the shift was 11%. In Florida, it was 9%. These changes have occurred not only because the party is growing in prosperous areas, but because it's also collapsing in struggling ones, a trend that has been most dramatic in the South. Middle-class counties in Tennessee, for instance, grew as a share of the Democratic electorate from 30 to 37.3%, and their raw vote shot up more than 50,000. But at the same time, poorer counties went from representing 66% of the electorate to 56.3%, and the raw vote plunged by over 120,000. What accounts for such profound changes to the Democratic coalition? Some argued the cultural aesthetic of liberal professionals has become toxic among voters without a college degree. Others believe the party has squandered its credibility with working class voters by failing to pursue a robust economic agenda. The former perspective counsels Democrats to move to the center on culture. The latter urges them to move left on economics. Ideally, Democrats should do both. But the truth is that these problems have been brewing for decades, and it's unclear if they can be reversed. It was during the mid-60s that the Democratic Party's traditional base in the white working class started defecting to Republicans, kicking off the slow-motion collapse of the New Deal coalition. Over the next decade, senior Democrats began contemplating how to attract new constituencies that could replace these voters. In December 1976, Jimmy Carter's pollster Pat Caddell wrote a memo arguing that the party's best bet was to capture the ballooning cohort of college-educated professionals emerging from the country's transition to a post-industrial economy. Caddell called for a development of an agenda that catered to this cohort's liberal cultural sensibilities and moderate economic views, one that eventually came to be known as neoliberalism. Well, I mean, there's a tremendous opportunity for the Republicans here if they would just stop being the party of the Chamber of Commerce, the party of the neocons. But that's where they get their money. That's where they get their money while they're running from their office, and that's where their post-office bribes come from. And frankly, people like Senator McConnell would rather lose than win. If it meant, having to be on the same side as deplorables, and if it meant they and most their wives and children not getting the payoffs that they get. Turns out people don't want to work in New York City. Who would have thunk it? This is from Andrea Blanco at the Daily Mail. Workers in the Big Apple are refusing to give up the comforts of working from home, which is 8% of the workforce back in the office 5 days a week, a new survey revealed. At least 28% of Manhattan office employees have continued to work fully remote. Perhaps the most revelatory finding is that 78% of workplaces now have a predominantly hybrid model approach, a startling contrast from just 6% in 2019. Mayor Eric Adams has pleaded with companies to prioritize mandatory attendance in order to stimulate the city's bruised economy and 7.6% unemployment rate, the worst in the U.S., thanks to the continued popularity of working from home. Workers readjusting to pre-pandemic rituals such as long commutes, juggling childcare, and physically interacting with colleagues have yet to make a full comeback to the office. Well, there's something else going on here that Mayor Adams, the city administration, has made it clear that they have no intention of taking violent criminals off the street. And by violent criminals, I mean criminals who are assaulting, robbing, raping people. It's just a revolving door because, these are the les miserables, the injured, the insulted, and the injured. Many of them are racialized. And since the justice system is by a definition white supremacist, any attempts to incarcerate such racialized people are, well, racist. So, and again, Asian people being attacked consistently by Black people, and somehow this is Donald Trump's fault. Well, Trump isn't in office anymore, and how attacking Trump is going to stop Black people from beating up elderly Asian men and women. That's it's a puzzler, isn't it? Let's talk about baby formula, America and you. This is from the Babylon Bee. Dateline Kyiv. This Wednesday, Reports poured in that thousands of babies have been smuggling themselves into Ukraine dressed as Ukrainian soldiers. The refugee infants say they are seeking leftovers from the federal aid Biden has sent to the war torn country. Wah, wah, wah. Baby translators at the border were able to render one newborn's helpless wails into English for reporters. This baby says he's a battle hardened Ukrainian commando and he wants some formula. Other babies at the border concurred, with the oldest baby speaking for the group through a baby translator. We trust our leaders to prioritize aid distribution well, as they did with billions to promote worldwide gender equity, billions in weapons as a going away present for the Taliban in Afghanistan, or this breathtaking act of generosity amid America's most severe recession in years. The baby spokesperson admitted that the choice to leave America was difficult, but that they knew it was the right choice. It was hard to leave our families, but when Biden made it clear that Ukraine was the place to go for help, we didn't ask questions. At publishing time, Biden celebrated that U.S. families, now rid of burdensome babies, could afford to contribute more in taxes to repay trillions for Build Back Better infrastructure spending. When asked about helping babies directly, he said, "Best I can do is federal funding for abortion." It's very difficult to get baby formula in the United States now. But the Biden administration has decided to rub some salt, a lot of salt, into this wound. And reading a story such as this, one has to conclude that the elite of the United States simply hates the people, except for, the blue ticks, the laptop class warriors. This is a story from Paul Bedard at the Washington Examiner. The nationwide shortage of baby formula that has sent mothers desperately rushing from store to store has evaded one lucky group: illegal immigrants detained by Border Patrol. According to videos posted by a Florida lawmaker, the Biden administration has been shipping pallets of baby formula to migrant holding facilities. They are sending pallets of baby formula to the border, said Republican Representative Kat Cammack in one of two online postings yesterday. Meanwhile, in our own district at home, we cannot find baby formula, she added, holding a photo of empty shelves where the formula would be. Cammack said that a border agent sent her photographs of the deliveries and she posted one online. They're receiving pallets and more pallets of baby formula at the border, she said, holding one of the photos showing both Advantage brand formula and Go-Go Squeeze applesauce. This was taken at Ursula Processing Facility in McAllen, Texas, where thousands are being housed and processed and then released. She said the agent told her, "Kat, you would not believe the shipment I just brought in. He has been a Border Patrol agent for 30 years and has never seen anything quite like this. He is a grandfather and is saying that his own children can't get baby formula." The shortage was sparked by a manufacturing issue and then a rush on stores. The shortage has become one of the issues coloring the concerns about growing inflation and economic troubles under President Joe Biden. The New York Times, for example, reported on the troubles Texas parents are having finding the formula that is being shipped by their homes to the migrant holding centers. In a story headlined, "A Baby Formula Shortage Leaves Desperate Parents Searching for Food," the New York Times said, "Some parents are driving hours at a time in search of supplies. Others are watering down formula or rationing it, hoping for an end to the shortage." Cammack said, "I don't know about you, but if I'm a mother anywhere, anytime in America, and I go to my local Walmart or Target or Publix or Safeway or Kroger or wherever it might be that you shop, and you are seeing their shelves and you are seeing signs that you are not able to get baby formula, and then you see the American government sending by the pallet thousands and thousands of containers of baby formula to the border, that would make my blood boil." Well, the Democrats need new voters. And so if your children can't, get baby formula, just think about, all the millions of new voters for the Democrats. Maybe that will make everybody feel better. Can't let that Trump get reelected. This is from Rob Weil at NBC News. The owner of a key baby formula manufacturing plant said Wednesday it is looking to restart its plant in as little as 2 weeks, but said it would take between 6 to 8 weeks to get formula products back on store shelves once production gets going again. The shutdown of the facility, owned by Abbott Laboratories and located in Sturgis, Michigan, has prompted a severe shortage of infant formulas, including Similac, Alimentum, and Elecare. The plant was shut down February pending a federal investigation into the deaths of 2 infants and reports of illnesses among other children who consumed certain baby formula products. The plant remains closed. And, let's talk about another shortage. This is from Sundance at The Last Refuge, aka the conservative treehouse.com. It has often been said that if you chase the global climate change ideology to its natural conclusion, we end up in communal groups sitting around a tepid campfire, eating some form of sustainable algae cakes and picking parasites off each other. Prior to Joe Biden, that prediction might have seemed like hyperbole. Now, not so much. Indeed, the Green New Deal energy policy of Joe Biden creates massive downstream consequences. Unfortunately, the White House doesn't seem to care. The high prices and scarcity of critical goods are a feature, not a flaw, as they chase their climate-friendly Build Back Better agenda. Following the continuum of intended consequence, we now have diesel fuel shortages beginning to hit the U.S. economy, and with scarcity comes higher prices of an almost astronomical scale. The national average price of diesel is now $5.54 per gallon, which is an increase of 22 cents from last week, which was when the most recent record was set. Data shows there's no state that's currently seeing diesel prices below $5.12 a gallon. Making matters even worse is a drop in available inventory of diesel fuel, which is about to become a crisis for the east coast of the U.S. Some truck stop operators like Love's and Pilot are already warning their big rig customers they may not have fuel for truckers. Well, why is this happening? I'm going to suggest that it's deliberate. I mentioned yesterday that the average price of an electric vehicle in the United States is $56,000. How many Americans can afford $56,000 for a vehicle? The Great Reset and Build Back Better means many fewer cars, many fewer cars. Ideally, only the 1% and higher members of the laptop class would be able to afford automobiles. The soaring price of food. You remember when globalists like, was it Tyler Cowen and the like, were talking years ago about cheap chalupas and how beans, when cooked properly, can be quite delicious? That's the plan. This is all deliberate. We're going to destroy worldwide supply chains because of a spurious conflict with Russia. Why? Why would they do that? I mean, aside from asserting again the unipolar hegemony of the United States government, someone must have given some thought to what the consequences on the ground were. And I think that after this thought was given, it was decided, no, this is a good thing because our way of life is unsustainable, blah, blah, blah. Too many useless eaters out there, too many proles, too many Untermenschens with aspirations. And I'm afraid we're going to have to crush this. Globalism has turned out to be enormously unpopular. When people discovered that, we're not going to make anything, we're going to send those jobs, to Mexico and to Asia. Okay, so what do we get instead? Oh, it's information economy, service economy. Are those jobs as good? No, they're nowhere near as good. They don't pay very much, in fact. And we see tremendous reaction all over the world, Western world anyway, against globalization. And the globalists decided to play their trump card. We can force globalization. We can starve you out. We have the power. I mean, gas guzzlers, they're killing the earth. There's no evidence that they're killing the earth. None whatsoever. Carbon is not a pollutant. But never mind that. And of course, there's going to have to be two different systems, the green system and the old-fashioned not green system. They don't talk about that. It's going to, we don't know whether the green energy can scale. We don't know whether that's true. As far as windmills go, they're a spectacular failure, and they're going to remain a spectacular failure. Besides uglifying not just the countryside and now oceans, but also being bird abattoirs. So we still need oil and gas, right? No, let's cancel the Keystone pipeline. And there's more. This is from thecentersquare.com. President Joe Biden canceled 3 pending oil and gas drilling leases in Alaska and the Gulf of Mexico this week as gas prices hit record highs. Biden has taken heavy fire for blocking new leases and pipelines as energy costs have surged, but has defended his record. This latest development intensified that criticism. We're just not going to. There's not going to be oil and gas. What's going to replace it? I don't know. Maybe we'll all be walking around with solar panels attached to us at all times, so we can heat ourselves that way. The media, the governments lie and the media lies. If you point out that the government is lying, and if you point out that the media is lying, you are called a conspiracy theorist, a dangerous person, because we know that misinformation is now violence. This is from Patrick Hauff at the Washington Free Beacon. Crack pipes are distributed in safe smoking kits up and down the East Coast, raising questions about the Biden administration's assertion that its multi-million-dollar harm reduction grant program wouldn't funnel taxpayer dollars to drug paraphernalia. The findings are the result of Washington Free Beacon visits to 5 harm reduction organizations and calls to over 24 more. In fact, every organization we visited, facilities in Boston, New York City, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, and Richmond, Virginia, included crack pipes in the kits. The kits became the subject of national attention in the wake of a Free Beacon report in February, indicating that the $30 million harm reduction program was set to fund the distribution of free crack pipes in so-called safe smoking kits. Pressed on the matter in a February 9th press briefing, White House Press Secretary Jen, not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki, issued a full-throated denial. Quote, "They were never part of the kit. It was inaccurate reporting. A safe smoking kit may contain alcohol swabs, lip balm, and other materials to promote hygiene and reduce the transmission of diseases," unquote. So they lied. And the mainstream media lied as well, because if Jen Psaki says it, it must be true. Harm reduction is a spectacular failure. Harm reduction has been what the elite method to mitigate the effects of illegal drug use, and it has been in power, if you will, around 25 to 30 years. We see the results. More and more people driven mad by drugs, and more fatal overdoses. But of course, the solution to the failure of harm reduction is more harm reduction. In my country, Canada, essentially, we're going to have the legalization of all drugs, which is almost the case now in Canada. Again, we can see the results in British Columbia, where I live. More people have died from illegal drug overdoses than the corona doom, but there are no lessons to be learned from that, apparently. Let's call people. Let's call the weak, the vulnerable, those who are not contributing to the GDP, troublesome young people, and, well, just old people generally. And you can see the disproportionate number of people in old age homes who died of COVID-19. What we're seeing is a dry run for something that's going to become a permanent policy. Let's go back to the chat. From Tarot Destroyer, the one world government leaders have now acquired full control of the money and credit machinery of the U.S. via the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank. It's a quote from Curtis Dahl, FDR's son-in-law. British American says, I find myself paying less and less attention to the news these days, just waiting for the big shocking headlines to appear, because again, night or the Prussians must come. That means something's got to give. I'm trying to get started as a new idiom, night or the Prussians must come. Try it. Alrighty. British American adds, green energy will never be scalable. Oh yeah, solar panels. Do you know where they're made? China. Do you know what they're made out of? Coal. Yes, that's right. Fear works better than food, says Brandon Smith. As mentioned previously, I'm rereading Kotkin's magisterial biography of Stalin. And of course, Lenin died a failure. He introduced the new economic policy, the NEP. And we're going to bring back capitalism because people are starving and you can't get grain, particularly for the cities. Stalin decided to crush the peasants. The peasants resisted communism. They had no objection to socialism. They resisted the Bolshevik dictatorship, and Stalin decided that they were going to be crushed. And if this resulted in the deaths of millions or tens of millions, well, so be it. And I think we're coming close to a similar situation in the West. I mean, Kotkin's thesis is controversial because in regards to the Holodomor, he does not believe, and he makes a good case for his argument, that this was not deliberately aimed at Ukrainians. In fact, in other republics, Kazakhstan, even higher proportion of the population died. That's where the grain was. So these places had to be hit the hardest. And I think it was to a certain extent peak. These people don't know how much we love them. We are preparing paradise on earth as we see it, and they're standing in the way, so they will get it in the neck. 56K for a vehicle with a lifespan of 7 to 10 years, points out Brandon Smith. People hearing talk of after Putin, says Brandon Smith. Jen's got a balcony you can do Shakespeare from, says Brian Frakes. Jokin 666 says, no disputing the Putin. Okay, who else? Anyone else see the latest Peppermint Patty, a.k.a. Jennifer Saki, appearance with the cleavage? That's British American? No, thankfully, no, not at all. Let's go back to Joseph Tainter and The Collapse of Complex Societies. And we're talking about the destruction of the Western Roman Empire and the latter part of that collapse. Other approaches failing, Emperor Diocletian attempted to control inflation by his famous and famously unsuccessful edict on prices issued in 301 AD. The increases in military strength and civil administration had to be supported by a depleted population. The consequence for the empire was a decline in personnel for agriculture, industry, the military, and civil service. Agriculture and industry accordingly declined. Agricultural labor became so scarce that landowners, to avoid conscription of their own laborers, bribed vagabonds to enlist instead. In Gaul, shortages of agricultural labor continued until the collapse, so that the victorious barbarians were able to appropriate land with minimal impact on the local population. Many barbarians were enlisted in the military. Indeed, in the later empire, barbarian colonies were planted within the depopulated lands under Roman rule. Height requirements for military recruits were lowered. By the late 4th century in the West, even slaves were sometimes enlisted. In 315 AD, Constantine ordered assistance for poor and orphan children in an attempt to reverse the demographic trend. This decline in population and in the supply of essential labor does much to explain the social and economic policies of Diocletian and Constantine. Conscription, which had been practiced before, was instituted as a regular practice by Diocletian. He levied guilds to supply the armies and the imperium. Gradually, families came to be frozen into essential occupations. In 313, Constantine required that soldiers' sons be likewise. A hereditary soldiery emerged with predictable problems. From 319 to 398, at least 22 laws were issued dealing with the sons of soldiers who sought to evade military service. From the early 4th century on, sons of civil servants were made to enter their fathers' offices. The same was required of workers in government factories, as well as many private sector occupations. Indeed, the distinction between the public and private sectors blurred as the state directed persons into occupations and levied their output. By the time of Diocletian, city offices, which were such a financial burden on their holders, had become hereditary. Since the very wealthy had by this time largely fled the towns to establish country villas or obtained exemptions, this burden fell on the middle income segment. Perhaps most important to the economy of the empire was the tying of agricultural labor to the soil. First mentioned in an announcement of Constantine's in 332, this had the effect of establishing a system of serfdom in which tenants were bound to large estates. The colonate, as it is known, was a boon to large landowners during a time of agricultural labor shortages. Colonnates continuously tried to escape unsatisfactory conditions to the army, the church, the civil service, the professions, and other proprietors. Concomitant with the decline in population and agricultural labor, there was a significant abandonment of arable and formerly cultivated land. In some provinces under Emperor Valens, 364 to 378, from one-third to one-half of arable lands were abandoned. This problem first appeared in the late 2nd century, perhaps due to the plague, and was a subject of imperial legislation from before Diocletian's time to that of Justinian, 527 to 565. In the late 3rd century, Aurelian had held city councils responsible for the taxes due on deserted lands. The shrinkage in areas cultivated was considerable in many localities. Of imperial lands in Africa, Proconsularis in 422 AD, over one-third were deserted. In adjacent Byzantine, more than one-half of the lands were untilled. Around the city of Cyrrhus in 451, over one-sixth of the lands were deserted. Abandoned lands by the 5th century in Africa were between 10 and 15% in some provinces, but ranged up to 50% in others. Responding to the situation, Constantine made the following discharge offer to his veterans. If they became farmers, they would be given free vacant land, 100 measures of seed, and 25 follis, the follis being worth 3/4 of a denarius. If they became anything else, the offer was reduced to 100 follis. 3 explanations are commonly offered for the abandonment: soil exhaustion, labor deficiencies, and barbarian raids. None of these is really satisfactory. The same agricultural techniques had been employed for centuries before Diocletian and continued for centuries after. The bulk of deforestation and erosion apparently came later in the Middle Ages and resulted from disregard of water and soil conservation measures in late Roman times. In Egypt, where the fertility of the soil was annually renewed by the Nile, abandonments were just as severe as elsewhere. Shortages of labor are more plausible, for landlords were always short of tenants and welcomed allocations of barbarian prisoners. But some landowners abandoned estates with agricultural slaves and tenants in place. Clearly, then, labor shortages were not the sole responsible factor. Barbarians ravaged only some parts of the empire, and not necessarily those with the greatest percentages of abandoned lands. They alone were not responsible for agricultural abandonment. Contemporaries of the event attributed it to overtaxation, and there is much to recommend this interpretation. The expensive government and military of the dominate are clearly implicated. One writer of the period went so far as to suggest that those who lived off the treasury were more numerous than those paying into it, which is very much a situation that we are close to in the West. Another complained that taxes, which were high even before the dominate, doubled from 324 to 364. In the 6th century AD, which postdates the fall of the West but illustrates the trend, Even privileged landowners paid twice as much tax as provincials had in the first century BC, and ordinary landowners paid well over 3 times as much. Even Italians found themselves taxed again. A major problem, in addition to the rate of the levy, was the rigidity of Diocletian's tax system. It was not designed to accommodate variations in the quality of land or fluctuations in yield. This was a flat tax levied on the land and on the number of residents. The government required that the land tax be paid whether a parcel was cultivated or not. Where possible, abandoned lands were sold or granted to new owners with a tax rebate, but if this failed, they were assigned compulsorily to other landowners, to all local landowners, or to municipalities for payment of taxes. Population figures for the poll tax remained as originally calculated, regardless of how population actually changed. Villages were held corporately liable for these taxes on their members, and one village could even be held liable for another. The rate of taxation was generally not progressive, so it rested more heavily on the poor and on those with large families. When wealthy individuals got their land underassessed, the extra share was distributed among the remainder. And the state always had a backup on taxes due, extending obligations to widows or children, even to dowries. The tax burden was such that peasant proprietors could accumulate no reserves, so if barbarians raided, or drought or locusts diminished the crop, they either bored or starved. Eventually, their lands passed to creditors, to whom they became tenants. As tenants, they paid half of their crops in rent, while proprietors owed 1/3 in taxes. Whatever crops were brought in had to be sold for taxes, even if it meant starvation for the farmer. Under conditions of famine, it was the farmers, amazingly enough, who were the first to suffer, often flocking to cities that held stores of grain. It is little wonder that the peasant population failed to recover. The collection of taxes and rents was so unvarying that, however poor the crop, the amount due was seized, even if the cultivators were left without enough. People couldn't meet taxes and so were jailed, sold their children into slavery, or abandoned their homes and fields. Circumstances were highly unfavorable for the formation of large families. As circumstances are highly unfavorable for the formation of large families in the West today, for the formation of families of any size, actually. I will have more from Tainter's The Collapse of Complex Societies tomorrow. In the meantime, oh yes, the Conservative Party of Canada, the opposition party, which was booted out of office in 2015, which is only 7 years ago. They've lost three elections in a row, but there's a new habit in Canada of having elections quite often. Being out of power for 7 years, it doesn't seem that disastrous. But yes, this is the most important leadership race ever. And where is the civility? Where is the civility? You know, when Justin Trudeau talks about people, anti-vaxxers, as he calls them, or vaccine skeptics, of them being misogynist and anti-science and racists, and asking whether they should be tolerated, one doesn't see people, certainly in the regime or the regime media, accusing him of lacking civility. There was a farcical debate held of the candidates for the Tories, and Paul Wells, formerly of Maclean's, now he has his own Substack, was not impressed. The Conservatives' Edmonton debate, yikes. You ran out of paddles during the lightning round question on binge watching. Sad trombone for you. He's not making any of this up. Well, that was a national disgrace. What was it about the last 2 years that made the Conservative Party of Canada's leadership election organizing committee decide Canadians are yearning for shorter conversations about sillier questions? Who came out of last week's thoughtful debate at the Canada Strong and Free conference, at least the questions and the format permitted thoughtfulness, although candidates varied in their ability or willingness to deliver it, thinking there weren't enough questions about TV viewing habits. Who surveyed at the issue landscape that will face Justin Trudeau on Thursday and would face a successor, war in Europe, inflation, labor shortages, stark conflict between climate targets and natural resource export imperatives, long cheated and still difficult indigenous reconciliation, exiting from COVID, and thought, keep the answers short. We want time to hear them out on what's on their playlist. I'm just going to break in here to say that I just think there'd be a tremendous audience for a Canadian politician, or an American politician for that matter, who said, climate change, climate emergency, climate extinction, I'm not worried about it. Why not? Because it's bogus. It's always been bogus. Is man causing the temperature of the earth to rise? Can't be proved. Bogus models and faked data. So no, we're not going to destroy the economy because of this chimera. Back to Wells. As a mechanism for allowing Canadians to weigh the judgment of 6 people, one of whom might, after all, be the next prime minister, the evening was a write-off. We learned that Leslyn Lewis likes Coltrane and was eager not to be asked to name a second musician, that Jean Charest likes Charles Aznavour and doesn't know how to pronounce Pat Metheny, that moderator Tom Clark isn't sure how to pronounce a Roman Baber, and that Charest and Scott Aitchison were reckless enough to trigger the dreaded sad trombone sound effect for the sin of mentioning the Prime Minister of Canada by name during a political debate. Probably didn't watch the debate, probably read that last paragraph and thought, well, Wells has finally lost his mind. It had to happen eventually. But no, this is a faithful record of whatever that just happened in Edmonton. Sorry, I'm stuck with the material. There's no way I could make this stuff up. If I were making something up, it would be funnier. Clearly, the organizers fell prey to 2 of the most fashionable current temptations in debate design: keep it snappy and let's get to know these candidates as people, as though the decline of modern government were caused by excessive reflection and insufficient attention to our leaders' public image. I'm not going to talk about Canada's involvement in the Ukraine because it's too stupid. And then, this segment was followed by the lightning round. Again, I swear I'm not making this up. At one point, big, goofy plastic prop paddles were handed out to the bemused candidates. This whole column is a test of your credulity. I get that. Be strong. Stare into the madness. Here's the trick, Clark said. There are 6 questions, and you can only use your paddle 5 times. Okay. Yes. They asked, what are you reading? Favorite musicians? What was the last time you binge watched, and what was it? As mentioned previously, my country's politics are controlled by PR spivs, and the meteoric rise of Pierre Poilievre has frightened a great many of these PR spivs, that perhaps PR spivs won't be in charge of Canadian politics. They really have nothing to worry about from Pierre Poilievre, nothing at all. It's going to be business as usual with him. Yes, efficiency, and we need to, cut red tape. People like him have been carrying on about these sort of things, since the late 70s, early 80s, since Ronald Reagan, you could say. Has it made any difference? No. Let's go to one of these PR spivs. This is a fellow who's always trotted out. He's been on television hundreds or thousands of times. His name is Tim Powers. There's 3 types of PR spivs, political PR spivs. Of course, there are conservative PR spivs, liberal PR spivs, and NDP PR spivs. But Tim Powers is furious at the lack of civility. Time for Tory leadership race to climb out of the sewer. That's the title of his piece in the Hill Times. Conservatives must ask themselves if they are falling victim to the ease of stoking and selling the politics of anger, while neglecting to carve a path forward that isn't always focused on feeding certain voting segments. How does Tim Powers think that people get elected? By promising things to people. That's how you get elected. And carving a path forward. Well, what does that mean? A path forward. Well, we want to go forwards rather than backwards. Okay, yeah. But what is the nature of this carving? What is it that's being carved? And terrible, terrible carrying on, obnoxious, pumped up wrestlers rolling around and fighting each other using whatever connived tricks possible to win. Lots of bravado, blarney, and glory for the winner among already dedicated fans, but no breakthrough moment with the broader public. The thing is, the Conservative Party of Canada is not looking to elect the next Hulk Hogan, The Rock, or Ronda Rousey. Apparently, this guy likes wrestling. They're trying to pick a leader and potentially a prime minister. Uber partisan fanboys and girls or anger. Infused liberal haters might love it when the apparent leading contender Pierre Poilievre repetitively and rudely went after Jean Charest about his relationship with Huawei. Yeah! Jean Charest in bed for big bucks with the Chinese communists at a time when the Chinese communists had kidnapped 2 Canadian citizens. It would just be so rude and not civil at all to make an issue of that. Most reasonable people are left scratching their heads about the ability of the Conservative Party to govern itself, Canada, and lead us into the world. Most reasonable Canadians are not paying very much attention to the Conservative leadership race. This is what I've called reporter's disease. Powers was never a reporter, but he is an generator of op-ed content. Everyone cares about politics as much as I do. No, very few people care about politics as much as you do, Tim Powers. There's undoubtedly anger and frustration on all manner of issues. Can you be specific? And frustration in the Conservative Party about its recent political performances, however, constantly catering to that anger as opposed to looking at ways to diffuse it, to address people's underlying angst, is a risky proposition for winning. Angst? Is that the problem here? Angst? Maybe the government has failed. Maybe the government fails to deliver, to act in the best interests of most Canadians. That's not interested in things like that. No, not interested in things like that. Oh, and one of the other candidates who no one has ever heard of and no one's paying attention to, he said that every time I hear about some conspiracy theory, I realize that there's going to be another group of swing voters in the Greater Toronto area that are just not going to come our way. Conspiracy theory, like the government was spying on Canadians with cell phones during Corona doom, tracking our movements. I hardly ever take my cell phone with me when I leave, so I wasn't being tracked all that much. Oh, it's totally secret. No, none of this information. We're not holding on the information. We're not tying the movements to individual names and putting them in some sort of database. No, because the government would never do that. The government would have no interest in learning how many times you left the house. Where did you go? Did you go to the bank? Did you go to a grocery store? Did you go to a liquor store, et cetera, et cetera? No. Why would the government have any interest in that? Well, they did because they were spying on people. One hardly knows whether the Canadian government has the legal powers to do so, but apparently the Canadian government has the power to do anything at all. Tim Powers says the Conservatives must ask themselves if they're falling victim to the ease of stoking and selling the politics of anger while neglecting to carve a path forward that isn't always focused on feeding certain CPC voting segments. When you spend elongated periods in opposition, you can develop unhealthy habits and practices. You become focused on scoring partisan points with Mel Gibson-like blood-curdling screams of freedom instead of coming up with real solutions. Social media has also made it easier to traffic the theater of outrage to a malleable audience. Breaking that addiction is even tougher, particularly if the lines get blurred between theater and thought. Got any specific ideas there, Timbo? No. I think what's going on here is that Tim Powers has got his panties in a twist because he's afraid that his clients, his PR spiv clients, might suffer from revolutionary Prime Minister Pierre Poilievre is not a revolutionary. He was carrying on about, oh, we need to do something about the housing crisis. Okay, how about immigration? No, that's untouchable. No, 450,000 a year. Yep. How we're going to bring all these foreigners in and we're going to bribe the provincial governments into accepting their bogus qualifications. Because growth, immigrants, they raise the GDP. And that's what he worships, is the GDP. My free enterprise is going to solve the problems. Is it now? My free enterprise is a rigged casino. Not my phrase. You may have seen it before. Where strangely, those who are the richest and most powerful get made whole when they make stupid gambles. Whereas if, you're not a member of the 1%, well, it's good luck to you. Oh, so you're in a non-essential business, are you? Sorry, you should have chosen richer parents. Andrew Coyne, who is wrong about everything, and has been wrong about everything for his entire career, he is absolutely furious at the Conservatives. Vaccine refusal, blockades, Bitcoin. What does any of this have to do with conservatism? Yes, your concern trolling is noted, Andrew Coyne. This is a man who confessed in the last election, but won. He voted for the New Democratic Party. Andrew Coyne is not a conservative. What conservatism means to him is making the GDP bigger. He begins very occasionally a party leadership race will turn on some burning question of policy. More often, they are brute contests of organizational muscle and name recognition with little in the way of substantive issues at stake. Okay, true enough. But this conservative leadership campaign is something else again, one that appears to be about neither the leadership. The party gives every sign of having made up its mind already. Nobody knows. So Pierre Poilievre gets large crowds at rallies. That means very little. The way you win conservative leaderships is signing up phantom armies of instant Sikhs members. That's how you win. Not by getting people to turn up at rallies. The only issue is who can take the most unhinged positions on the fringiest topics. I'm not talking here about the combative, that is vicious tone of the debate, the personal attacks and whatnot, the subject of much commentary afterward. Neither is my complaint that the candidates are not centrist enough or too ideologically conservative. Yes, Andrew Coyne is going to tell us what conservatism is. He says that the party is not nearly ideological enough. What he means by that is there's not enough an obsession with process, because that is the only thing that Andrew Coyne believes in. In its current incarnation, it leans more to out-and-out whack jobbery, conspiracy theories of various kinds. Is it George Soros who's secretly controlling our lives? Or is it the World Economic Forum, vaccine denialism, and cheering on the lawless mob that took over Ottawa earlier this year? Oh, okay. So is George Soros a billionaire? Is he a powerful man? Does he influence policy making in the United States? Does he donate large sums of money to get district attorneys elected who are not going to prosecute criminals? Why, yes, he does. The World Economic Forum, is that a powerful and influential organization? Yes, it is. And the World Economic Forum says that by the year 2030, you will own nothing, you will have no privacy, and you will like it. Golly, it seems to me they're getting their way, doesn't it? And I don't know whether Andrew Coyne is actually keeping up with the data about the corona doom. The vaccines have moved into negative efficacy territory. But he is still singing from the hymn book that, oh, yes, these sacrifices were necessary. What sacrifices did Andrew Coyne make? None whatsoever. He writes, there is a libertarian streak of conservatism that would reflexively question the need for lockdowns or vaccine mandates. Reflexively. Did you catch that? Reflexively. We are going to take away everyone's freedoms to the extent that we're going to tell you that you can't leave your house, or you can't go to the park, or you can't sit on a park bench, or you can't go to the beach. So that would be sort of, a reflexive. Oh, yeah, well, if government decides because of a respiratory disease that, let's see, questions. Are you over 75? Are you morbidly obese? Are you severely immunocompromised for whatever reason? If you're not, the chances of being seriously affected by corona doom are, well, tiny. But let's just destroy society, abolish freedoms, just the most basic freedoms, wreck the economy, and you'd have to be some sort of some reflexively bad person. And he goes on to say, oh, a thinking libertarian would take into account the exceptional circumstances that compelled such extraordinary measures, a lethal pandemic that has killed in excess of 15 million people worldwide and would have killed many times that number in their absence. Yeah, keep on telling yourself that, Andrew Coyne. And he says that in the midst of the worst international security crisis since the Second World War, nothing that goes on in the Ukraine has any relevance to Canada whatsoever. Nothing at all. There's a constituency for conservative thinking on these and other issues. Andrew Coyne is not a conservative. Once again, don't call yourself a conservative, because if you do, you get the likes of, I don't know, David Frum in the United States or Andrew Coyne in Canada telling you what you are allowed to think, and more important, what you are definitely not allowed to think. Another person who went crazy about Corona doom was a Toronto Star columnist, Bruce Arthur, railing against people doing their own research, not listening to the experts. Oh, what's Bruce Arthur's expertise? He was a jock sniffer, a sports columnist for years and years and years before he got the Corona doom beat, and we're all gonna die. It doesn't look like it, but the variants, the variants are coming. Yeah. The evidence is that the variants are going to be milder and milder and milder, except quite possibly for those people who have been triple vaxxed and perhaps quadruple or quintuple vaxxed. The incoming data there, not encouraging. Not at all. Now, Poilievre has picked a fight with the Bank of Canada. And yeah, okay. What Poilievre doesn't seem to understand is that the money supply, which is fueling the inflation, is determined by the level of federal spending, federal borrowing. The Bank of Canada can raise or lower interest rates, and the Bank of Canada has decided it's going to take the ever so mild action to curb inflation. It's not going to do any good. And of course, Pierre Poilievre has, he has planted the Bitcoin flag. And more on that later. Oh, and when your idea of freedom includes the convoy, it's easier still. Jessica Marin Davis is the president of Insight Threat Intelligence. Oh, a former senior strategist in Canadian intelligence and the author of a book on international terrorist financing. She points out that of the money sent to the Ottawa convoy, the vast majority of the million or so crowdfunding sites was frozen, leaving approximately 30,000, but over 830,000 came in via cryptocurrency. Quote, with the crypto, we do know that there are a lot of some high-profile donations, but the problem is that a lot of the donations were done from wallets that were not attributed to individuals, so we just simply don't know. On the other hand, it's super useful for money laundering, and it's super useful for other forms of illicit financing, and it's somewhat useful for terrorist financing. And I would say it's somewhat useful for other forms like financing criminal mischief, as we saw in the convoy, unquote. Okay, yeah. So the government needs to know where every single dollar that you spend, where it comes from. They need to know, because otherwise the terrorists will have won. And people who used to call themselves liberals are all in favor of this. Oh, Andrew Coyne. Yeah, he is. He's all right, Jack. You know, the managerial class, and he is very much a member of the managerial class, whether he'd be willing to admit it or not. They have done quite well out of the Corona doom. He wrote today, yes, what is 30 years of low inflation, economic stability, rising incomes, and record employment while navigating through a once a century financial crisis, a once a century pandemic, and the worst security crisis since World War II, compared to a few months of above target inflation? Was that how you describe it? Above target inflation? Economic stability, rising incomes for whom? Andrew Coyne. Rising incomes for laptop class people like him. A once in a century pandemic. Well, as that scientist at Tel Aviv University said a few months ago, if this hadn't been identified as the novel coronavirus and there hadn't been a fuss made about it, no one would have noticed. The once a century financial crisis, is he referring to 2007, 2008? Where a bunch of greedy capitalists nearly wrecked the world economy. And what was the result of this? That the same people were given even more power. The worst security crisis since World War II. Perhaps the security crisis is that poor Andrew Coyne can't get to sleep at night because he's imagining, thinking of the suffering of the ho-holes. Of course, Andrew Coyne is a warmonger. Pure and simple. Pure and simple. He seems to get very excited when foreigners die. This is from Portfolio Armor again at Zero Hedge, a layman moment for crypto. Crypto is in a sea of red now, with even the blue chip of the bunch, Bitcoin, down 30% for the last week. But the most dramatic fall has been in the Terra, or Luna coin, which is down about 99% over the same time frame. Luna is a complement to Terra's US dollar stablecoin UST, which until recently was pegged to the dollar a dollar. Yeah, probably not such a good idea for Pierre Poilievre to go into these rhapsodies about Bitcoin, because if you followed it even casually, as I have, it tends to go like this. And there are so many people have been whacked so hard by catastrophic drops in the value of a Bitcoin that highly risky, highly risky. Here is a story from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. A professor who advocated for longer lockdowns in his role as a SAGE government advisor now admits that the negative impacts of lockdowns were never included in SAGE modeling and that they should have been. Professor John Edmonds was part of the SAGE team that told the government there would be 6,000 Omicron deaths per day in the absence of another lockdown late last year. In reality, the death toll never got anywhere near that number, as the doomsayers were proven spectacularly wrong yet again. Now, Edmonds admits that the economic harm and the knock-on health effects of lockdown were harms that, in principle, could have been factored into models, but practice they were not. The professor called for an extended lockdown in summer 2021 and said the government was taking a risk by lifting restrictions, but now says some of the alarmist death projections put out by SAGE were, quote, truly eye-watering. The epidemiological model is the only one component of decision-making, and I wondered and I worried that we'd had too much weight. There is, of course, an enormous economic impact from many of the interventions and other indirect impacts on psychological health and so on. Now, these in principle could be included, but in practice they were not. Unquote. Will Jones commented, joy shall be in heaven over one sinner that repenteth and all that. But you can't help feel the recantation is very convenient as we move on from the pandemic and people start to look back with more objectivity at all the crazy, costly things that were done in the name of science and at the behest of modelers. Unquote. quote. Do these people ever suffer for being wrong? As William Briggs likes to say, that models, they say whatever you tell them to say. This is not some sort of crystal ball that can foresee the future. It doesn't have any arcane, occult powers. No. If this happens, then this happens. If this happens, then this happens. The suppositions are built into the model. Some people are unwilling to let go. This is from Alexander Tin at CBS News. 2 of the Biden administration's top doctors now say they are now choosing to wear masks indoors, even in communities officially deemed to have low levels of COVID-19. I've been masking more, partially because I've really had engagements that I really wanted to get to and didn't want to have to cancel, said Dr. Rochelle Walensky, director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Okay. You will recall that when Rochelle Walensky was appointed to this position last year, she gave a news conference in which she moaned about how scared she was. That's the word she used. Tears welled up in her eyes. So I suppose it's not a surprise to see her still wearing these stupid face diapers. Walensky's decision echoes similar comments made last week by Dr. Anthony Fauci, the president's chief medical advisor, during an interview in which he explained his decision to skip the White House correspondents' dinner. Fauci said he would not necessarily wear a mask in small gatherings where he knew others were vaccinated, but cited his own risk aversion against attending larger unmasked gatherings. One wonders, again, whether Dr. Fauci has been paying attention to the data, which in terms of vaccine efficacy has been disastrous, absolutely disastrous for panic mongers such as him. Let's go to Steve Kirsch's Substack. My letter to the editor on mask wearing. Feel free to adapt your local paper. Here's a letter I wrote to my local newspaper. Feel free to modify this letter for your local newspaper and submit it. The recent mask study in Finland was the best mask trial to date. It showed that if there was any effect at all, mask made it more likely you would be infected. UCSF professor Vinay Prasad acknowledged this in a recent YouTube video on his channel. In addition, the highly acclaimed Bangladesh mask study was thoroughly debunked by UK math professor Norman Fenton, who asked the journal to retract or correct the study. Also, the first author of the Bangladesh study, Jason Abaluk, was unable to defend the study in a 2-hour discussion with medical journal editor James Lyons Weiler. Maybe it's time for politicians to respect what science tells us. If they have better science, then they should tell us what it is. If they don't, they should follow the best science. Please, let's stop making the problem worse. I don't know. I guess it makes people feel better, or some people feel better, that they're responsible citizens. And, oh, wait. This is tested breaking news. Well, it's from 2 days ago. Bill Gates, I've tested positive for COVID. I'm experiencing mild symptoms and I'm following the expert's advice by isolating until I'm healthy again. Bill might want to lose some weight. Is there anything more ridiculous than the statements public officials make every time one of them tests positive? This is Alex Berenson. They all have to reassure, no, sorry, it's Eugippius. They all have to reassure everyone that yes, they're super vaccinated. Yes, they're self-isolating at home. Yes, their symptoms are mild. Aside from the passing amusement of seeing a hysterical virus botherer infected despite every precaution, literally nobody cares. No journalist will ever follow up to see if Gates is okay. Not a single person anywhere expects that he might come to harm. It's a strange dissonance. On the one hand, we're expected to maintain a permanent war footing against this very dangerous virus. On the other hand, not even Gates cares that it's replicating in his airway. Maybe it's time for celebrities, politicians, and loser philanthropists to shut up around their infection status. And I can't stop laughing about this guy, Gates' sole sycophantic well-wisher. Yes, not a lot of support for Bill. Let's go now to, yeah, we went to Egyptius. Let's go to Alex Berenson. Okay, nothing new there. Let's go to the Daily Skeptic. And here we are. News roundup. NHS waiting list spikes to another record high of $6.4 million. I was reading David Wright, who's an Englishman, talking about this. Sorry, Frank Wright, saying that the NHS, the National Health Service, appears to have collapsed. That all sorts of doctors who don't want to do their jobs, all sorts of hospital staff who don't want to do their jobs, and there doesn't seem to be any way they can be compelled to do their jobs. The truth about Britain's COVID deaths. Matthew Paris in The Spectator notes how little relationship there is between pandemic deaths and restrictions, and how small the death tolls were in the scheme of things. And modelers predict 1.5 million deaths in China if lockdown is lifted, but that is less than half the UK COVID death rate. England has had lower rate of COVID deaths since Freedom Day than Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, in spite of fewer restrictions. More politicians admit we're fighting a proxy war with Russia. MPs call on the government to properly compensate the vaccine injured. Mask mandate dropped for air travel in Europe. It hasn't been dropped in Canada because Justin Trudeau is determined to spitefully punish me and people like me, perhaps forever. I'm really getting the impression now that the vaccination mandate for air travel, train travel, is never going to be lifted in Canada. Not under a Liberal government in any way. Climate scare stories flood local media courtesy of well-funded U.S. green agitprop operation. Yes, this is called Climate Central. Based in Princeton, New Jersey, it claims to work with news outlets to produce compelling and scientifically accurate feature stories helped by its own research. On the flood stories, it supplies a free interactive map and web tools that can be used by often cash-strapped local media to produce catastrophe-laced stories based on what are obviously wildly improbable sea level rises. Well, it could happen, as Briggs would say, that there is a non-zero chance, right? Let's go to William Briggs. What would you call the style of bad writing? Describing writing isn't that different from writing about painting. You want to say what the writing or the picture is about, but words fail. The essence is slippery, the description merely incomplete. Maybe the best you can is to show the painting or writing and let others see for themselves what it's all about. Yet, knowing this, the urge remains. So let me try to describe a kind of writing now common in certain religious quarters, the kind of writing that when you come across it, a feeling of nausea develops. The kind where you can't say in any given word or sentence exactly what has gone wrong, but that when it's all put together, the disease is obvious. This kind of writing might be best captured in one word: effeminate. Start with the headline. The typo for once isn't mine or my enemies. Many laity find Catholic Church to be judgmental and condemning. I guess only 1 in 100, maybe fewer, see the contradiction. Do you? If you can't, then substitute judge for find. The two are synonyms here, and read the headline again. If you don't like that swap, try condemn for fines. The you're all judgmental fallacy is similar to the imposing your beliefs fallacy. Both slide judgments and impositions in arguments under disguise. Every time somebody says don't be judgmental, they are being judgmental. Every time somebody says don't try to impose your beliefs, they are trying to impose their beliefs. That's one. Here's 2 and 3. Quote, earlier this year, laity were invited to meet and discuss issues within the Catholic Church in a listening process that is part of the build-up to the Synod on Synodality called by Pope Francis and scheduled to take place next year, unquote. The bizarre scare quotes around listening trigger me. The bile rises to my molars. It's gay, pathetic, squeamish, and condescending all at once. Just what in the world, I mean, the world itself, do you need to listen to at this late date? Who cannot see the signs? As we discussed before, synod means meeting, as in people sitting around and listening to words they don't hear, drinking stale coffee, pretending not to stare at their phones, making idiotic and asinine comments in an effort to signal to the attendees one's importance or intelligence, always a self-refuting act. Meetings. So what in the unholy hell can a synod and synodality mean except meeting on meetingness? As in, let's get together in a meeting and discuss the nature of getting together in meetings. As in, how can we spread the spirit of meetingness and encourage people to have meetings? It is therefore obvious synodality is not a word, but a cartoon of a word, designed purely as a signal, a code word. When someone in earnest speaks synodality, he looks for the heads that nod and knows he has found allies. The same heads bounce when hearing judgmental and condemning. The code word therefore describes the group who wish to pass judgment and condemn the church, the group who wishes to impose their values on the church. When this is done openly and clearly, as by, say, the ACLU or some woke scatterbrain, we understand it. The enemy identifies himself in an admirable way. When it is done by code, by synods on synodality, we know we are dealing with spies and covert action. Never mind, back to the writing. There are some words on some document or other than this, quote, according to an initial analysis of the diocesan reports for the tablet, there is a sense of the unity of voice with which the Catholic laity have spoken, unquote. Unity of voice? What was it the Valley Girls used to say? Gag me with a spoon. Make it a big one, the kind with serrated edges used to scrape out grapefruit. Anything to end the pain. It goes on and on like this. Right after another instance of synodalians condemning and judging and condemning, we see the true desire revealed. They want a, quote, more tolerant attitude towards those deemed to be in irregular relationships. And they say the church's position on women was seen as anachronistic and damaging, unquote. Briggs concludes, well, I've said it 1,000 times, but the church still will not let men become nuns. This angers many. And let's talk about Biden's ministry of truth. Nina Jankowicz confessed in a tweet last year that for the first time in years, she doesn't have open wounds on her scalp. So why would that be? Because she mentioned two conditions, one of which had mania in it, trichomania or something like this, which I suppose is similar to phomicosis, they call it, where she believes that there's something underneath her scalp. So she was tearing up her scalp with her fingernails, which is a symptom of neurodivergence. Wouldn't you say? Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News, the head of what has been dubbed the Biden administration's Ministry of Truth, previously compared free speech to, quote, fairy dust, unquote, during testimony about social media censorship in front of the UK Parliament. Yes, really. Nina Jankowicz, recently appointed the Department of Homeland Security's disinformation czar, made the comments while providing oral evidence regarding the implementation of the UK's controversial online safety bill, which will ban legal content which has the potential to cause harm. After agreeing that the government should set minimum speech standards which ban misogyny, Jankowicz blasted alternative social media platforms for supporting, quote, freedom of expression and fairy dust, unquote. She also said that government-connected communication regulators such as Ofcom should be able to establish the minimum standards that would be applied to all platforms and incur fines. That could be based again on the pre-existing terms of service, she added. Jankowicz also endorsed empowering governments to demand data on individual users from social media sites for the purpose of implementing further censorship policies. She said, quote, the social media platforms can do that if they are compelled to, unquote. Jankowicz also asserted that social media platforms should utilize algorithms that would allow us to get around some of the free speech concerns by demoting content so few people saw it. You can shout in the black void, but you do not get a huge audience to do that. The comments are in line with previously made statements by Jankowicz when she revealed that free speech made her shudder, while also promoting the lie that the Hunter Biden laptop story was Russian disinformation. The disinformation czar also ludicrously cited Christopher Steele as an expert on disinformation. Steele was the author of the infamous Clinton campaign-funded Trump P-Gate dossier that turned out to be an actual product of disinformation. As previously highlighted, Jankowicz previously demanded that trustworthy, verified people like her be given the power to edit other people's tweets, making Twitter more like Wikipedia. And again, so long as it's not illegal, I'm going to mention Jankowicz's lantern jaw, a very mannish jaw. She kind of looks like a man in a wig. I can still say that. So I am going to enjoy your freedoms while you can, brothers and sisters. Let's take a final look at the chat. Okay. Unclean Spirit, David the Gnome, speaks of quirky girl syndrome, says, yo, mama. Have you heard of Morgellons syndrome? Or just Morgellons disease? Joni Mitchell, the Canadian singer-songwriter, claims to have it. These people claim that there are things right underneath their skin. They look like carpet fibers. And I thought, well, this is obviously bogus. Everyone has a smartphone now. You take a picture of it. I mean, if they look like carpet fibers and they're right below the skin, let's see all the pictures of the people with the carpet fibers right underneath their skin. It's obvious that they're neurodivergent. Respectable commenting name, hello, says, what's the old adage? When they outlaw X, only outlaws will have it. I have not heard the word scabies in years, says Don Willis. Hello to Pete Bauman. Worms. Scabies. Favorite song on the original Nuggets compilation? Yeah, that's a very famous Lenny Kaye, a Rolling Stone writer, later guitarist with the Patti Smith group. He compiled this in the early 1970s. It was a tremendous influence on punk rock. Is garage music, is what it was. And this is original artifacts from the first psychedelic era. There have been so many different versions of this. Let's see. Psychotic Reaction. Okay, yeah. I'm going to go with Psychotic Reaction. Okay, so let's go back to the chat here. Oh, Tobacco Road. The Nashville Teens version of Tobacco Road. There were lots of British bands playing American music in 1964. It didn't sound very good, but the Nashville Teens doing a John Loudermilk song, it's just astonishing for the time at how hard driving it is. Ramp up masks for the midterm virus they plan, says Don Willis. Okay, KMG, who would win between Wellington and Jackson at New Orleans? Well, Wellington needed the Prussians, didn't he? So, I don't know. We could go with Andy Jackson. Respectable commenting name says, I will never give up my right to say very unkind things about people like Jankowicz. Well, under the defamation law, abuse, vulgar abuse has never been considered defamatory, But now, women like Jankowicz are weeping or claiming they've been traumatized because, people reply to their tweets with "you suck" or something, maybe much nastier, cruder, or whatever. But yeah, she can dish it out, but she can't take it. I know that's a cliched expression, but it's very true. Hello, Tom Anderson. And as an Ohioan, I was astonished to learn that Tecumseh is considered a Canadian hero, says Yo Mama. Well, to the extent that Canada is allowed to have any heroes, to the extent that Canadians learn anything about their history, except that we were terrible meanies, terribly mean to the Indians who sat around in a circle and held hands and protected the land and shared everything and never practiced, slavery or torture or genocide. Okay. Hello to Pro Commenter Man. Okay. I think I'm going to wrap it up here. I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it, as always. If you would like to make a donation to the live stream, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. And if you are in Canada, donations may be made directly to the live stream via interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And I leave you with this, as always, in these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse. I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.